This Skyward Sword remaster has proven to be an absolute magnet for drama from the moment it was announced. People don't think the game looks good, people think it costs too much, people are mad that it was announced instead of anything related to Breath of the Wild 2, people were mad that the special edition controllers were sold separately instead of included like in the original game. The drama is endless. I have a video about most of it if you'd like to hear my take, but the TLDR is that I agree that the game is too expensive, just like all Nintendo remasters are, but I disagree with the idea that it hasn't done enough to look like a remaster. This time though, we're here to talk about the freshly announced Amiibo coming out alongside the game, an absolutely gorgeous sculpt of Zelda and her Loftwing. The first wave of controversy came out alongside the announcement of the Amiibo when Nintendo explained what the in-game use of the Amiibo would be, namely that it would serve as a form of teleportation. You can use it to teleport from a location in the sky to a location anywhere on the ground, even in dungeons or buildings, almost like an actually useful Faeror's Wind from Ocarina of Time. This made people angry because to many, it felt like Nintendo was locking a quality of life gameplay feature behind a paywall. Many people think that Amiibo functionality should be restricted to mild, small little things or cosmetic bonuses. Then the next day, while the debate over this was still raging, Nintendo dropped another bombshell. The Skyward Sword Amiibo would cost $10 more than a regular Amiibo by USD, even more for other countries like here in Canada. This combination meant that an extremely useful gameplay feature is locked behind an Amiibo that's more expensive than a normal one. This set off another wave of complaints and discussion. If you've watched my video on the Skyward Sword announcement, or if you follow me on Twitter or are part of my Discord, you'll probably know that I've been pretty defensive of the Skyward Sword remaster so far. While I admitted that it was definitely too expensive, I went to great lengths to argue against the idea that it was a lazy or not good enough remaster. So you're probably expecting me to take Nintendo's side on this issue too. But you'd be wrong, I actually find this entire situation to be pretty lame. Before we get into it, I want to make two things clear. First, to those of you who are going to get the statue anyways because you love the sculpt, or you love the game, or you just really want that feature, please understand that I'm not blaming you. It is true that the only way to stop these practices is to not fund them, but I think Nintendo of all companies has shown that they'll misinterpret not paying every time. Instead of thinking, I guess they don't like Amiibos with gameplay functionality, Nintendo will probably end up thinking, I guess they don't like Skyward Sword Amiibos. Guess we better hold back on Skyward Sword merch in the future. I know that's how Nintendo is, and as it usually is when it comes down to these consumer versus corporate issues, it's the fault of the corporation, not the consumer. It is an absolutely gorgeous sculpt, and if you want to have that bad boy sitting on your mantle, I'll not judge you for it. I do hope you'll listen to what I say with an open mind, and maybe I'll help sway you to agree that the practice itself is not good. But we're all fans of Nintendo here. There is no antagonism from me to you over the fact that you chose to buy a figure that you really like, and I hope it looks fantastic wherever you choose to put it. Secondly, I have seen so many people talking about how those of us who have issues with this controversy or any other Skyward Sword controversy are just being whiny, entitled fans. I see those two words used a lot, and I just gotta say, don't be ridiculous. Almost every time I see somebody throw those words out, I can go to their Twitter page, scroll down a bit, and find them being the whiny, entitled fan about a different controversy. Half of you calling other people whiny and entitled were being equally so a couple months ago over the Age of Calamity plot twist. And a bunch of you were recently complaining at Nintendo about the lack of Breath of the Wild 2 news. Some of you were complaining about the lack of Animal Crossing updates, others were complaining about Pokemon Sword and Shield. And I know that it's not all the same people because I've seen it with my own eyes. I've seen people complain about one thing and then go on to call people entitled for complaining about something else. You might think that your issue is worth complaining about, whereas somebody else's issue is just them being whiny, but plenty of people think you're being whiny about your issue too. So how about we all just stop calling each other entitled for complaining about products that we spend a lot of money on, and understand that everybody has different issues. And if you literally have never complained once about a Nintendo product ever, well, I guess you've earned your spot beside Gunpei Yokoi and Satoru Iwata in Nintendo heaven. Good job. Okay, so first I want to talk about the price issue because though it still bothers me, I find it way less egregious of the two issues. The Zelda and Loftwing Amiibo cost $25, which is about $10 more than a regular Amiibo. To be clear, this isn't the first time that an Amiibo has been a higher price. Amiibo coming out at different prices to match the size or sculpt is a fairly regular practice. Even during the Breath of the Wild launch, the Guardian Amiibo was more expensive than the rest of them, which makes sense when you consider the difference in size and detail. But the reason that this bothers me is because the Zelda Amiibo doesn't really look like it's worth $25. Now don't get me wrong, the sculpt is gorgeous and probably one of the nicer ones that I've seen in terms of Amiibo. If the actual model on sale looks even close to as good as the advertisement, it's going to be a gorgeous piece. But equally good looking pieces have come out at lower prices. I think the Link Amiibo from Skyward Sword is also extremely well sculpted. Something about the Skyward Sword art style lends really well to Amiibos. But while Link looks just as good as Zelda, he doesn't cost that much. I've seen it argued all over the place that the increased price is due to there being 2 characters on the base, Zelda and her Loftwing, but this falls pretty flat too. Let's bring up the aforementioned Guardian Amiibo again. It's pretty darn big, about the size of 2 characters if you add up the base and the legs. So in theory the Guardian should have costed a great deal more than Zelda and her Loftwing, but in reality, on launch it cost about $6 less. Well, actually you might argue, the increased price is not because of the overall size, it's because 2 characters means twice the sculpting. Twice the detail means a big increase in price. And again, that doesn't really work out. We don't even need to look outside the Zelda series to show why this doesn't work. Look at this, it's Link on a mount. Both of them are quite detailed, running in at the price of a base Amiibo. The extra sculpting needed there didn't lead to an increased $10 in price. If you need more than a single example, let's look at Ice Climbers or the Duck Hunt duo, all priced regularly. You can argue that the sculpt on the Skyward Sword Amiibo is more detailed than the other duos, but then I would just point you back to the extremely detailed Guardian or Link on his horse, or even Midna and Wolf Link, who I will remind you came with the game they were released alongside, and say that your argument doesn't really work. Skyward Sword is priced $10 more because Nintendo wants to price it at $10 more, and I think that is kinda lame, but ultimately Nintendo can price it at whatever they would like to, and it isn't that big of a deal. Now let's get to the meat of the real issue. The Amiibo itself has a special feature when scanned into Skyward Sword, which allows you access to a teleport ability anywhere. What this essentially means is that Nintendo is developing a quality of life feature that a lot of people would like to have and sticking it behind a physical paywall. Look, before we get into the rest of this conversation, I want to give you a frame of reference to consider the rest of this video within as we watch it, and I want you to be honest with yourself about this. If it was any other company doing this, other than Nintendo, would you still be okay with it? If it was Ubisoft or EA releasing a gameplay feature tied to a separate physical purchase, would it still be not that big of a deal, or would you be saying typical EA? Just keep that in mind as I make my arguments. Now, in general, I'm a guy who's pretty against microtransactions and most forms of DLC. I have a rule that if a game comes out with microtransactions or day one DLC, or puts things that should be in the base game in DLC, I'll buy it used so the developers don't get a cent from me. It is fundamentally gross to sell a game at launch that is incomplete, because it's very possible to reward your players for spending a little bit of extra money without depriving the players who couldn't afford that extra money from a gameplay experience. The Skyward Sword Amiibo is symbolic of a wider issue that I and many others have had with Nintendo and their Amiibo practices. Nintendo has been gating off content via Amiibo for a long time, and it's just as tiresome every time. I remember quite a few years ago, Jim Sterling released a video talking about the issues with Amiibo, and a lot of this video will be relating to ideas they came up with, and applying them to the realm of Zelda. So I recommend you watch that video too. The ability to fast travel is something that should be worked into the base game. That isn't a fun little extra, that is a fundamental quality of life feature that people who have it are going to be utilizing through the entire game. The unique gestures in Monster Hunter Rise are fun little extras. The costumes in Breath of the Wild are fun little extras. The ability to teleport from location to location is not a fun little extra, and it is kind of ridiculous to say so. I've seen the argument that the base Skyward Sword was built without teleportation, and so including it and segmenting it off to the side is not a big deal. People got by without it before, they can get by without it now. And I mean, that is true, I suppose, but it's also kind of silly. The entire purpose of remastering a game is to release it for a modern audience and have a chance to address things that made it difficult for people to play before, and especially difficult for people who try it now. I don't know if you've engaged with criticism of Skyward Sword with any amount of frequency. I know a lot of it is really frustrating to read for somebody who loves Skyward Sword, because so much of it seems to be totally off base. But some of the criticism I do genuinely find to be correct is people complaining about how awful the loft wings feel to control, and how boring the sky is to traverse. And I fully agree. Maybe the loftwing flying will be better, we'll have to see, but having to navigate it is definitely a bit of a pain, and Skyward Sword is one of the only Zelda games to not give you the ability to teleport from wherever you're standing. Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask have the teleportation songs, Twilight Princess has Midna's teleport, Wind Waker has a teleport, Breath of the Wild has a teleport, Skyward Sword now also has a teleport, but it is also now the only one that charges extra money. Does that really seem fine to you? A remaster is supposed to add quality of life features to the game as a reason for buying it. Of course, the example that's most frequently brought up is what if Nintendo tied the Swift Sail in Wind Waker HD to an Amiibo? You can say that this is different because the slow sailing was such a fundamental complaint people had with Wind Waker, but again I would urge you to engage with some criticism of Skyward Sword. Read past the people who complain about the bad motion controls while also ignoring Fi's pleas for them to change the batteries, and see that it is a pretty common complaint among people who don't like Skyward Sword that traveling through the sky kind of sucks. At the end of the day, it really sucks that Nintendo gates off access to gameplay and amiibos. My favorite kind of amiibo bonus is the one you can see in Yoshi's Woolly World, where every time you scan your amiibo, your Yoshi changes its color palette to match the amiibo that you scanned. That is totally fun and totally harmless. Imagine if Skyward Sword did something similar. Scanning an amiibo would change your loftwing colors to match the amiibo you scanned, or your shield would change to have the logo of whatever game series the character is from. I absolutely adore these kinds of bonuses. I'm even fine with amiibo that have gameplay effects that don't lead to people missing out. The ability to call in a supply crate of useful items, like in Breath of the Wild, or the ability to heal yourself like in Mario Odyssey. All that is totally fine because it doesn't lead to people missing out. I am less okay with cosmetics being locked behind amiibo, like again in Breath of the Wild, for reasons we'll talk about in a moment, but I'm still fundamentally okay with it. It isn't gameplay, and none of the costumes you can get with the amiibo let you experience anything gameplay-wise that you couldn't also get with another costume. And you know, I'd be totally okay with the inclusion of the teleport if they just made a way to get it in-game as well. Tie it to a new long quest line or at the bottom of some challenge dungeon. There's a dozen ways they could go about it. If it's attainable in-game, the amiibo just serves as a shortcut, and that's totally swell. You might make the argument that this would make the amiibo pointless and nobody would buy them, but I'd like to point out that this has already happened. Scanning amiibo in Mario Odyssey gives you access to unique costumes, but you can also get those costumes in-game. The amiibo just serves as a shortcut. Or at the very least, make the in-game features purchasable as DLC so people can't miss out. I also want to clarify that I'm not complaining about the amiibo because I'm too poor to afford it. Trust me, I'll be playing with the teleportation too, but I won't be buying the amiibo. I'm just gonna buy a 90-cent NFC sticker, transfer the amiibo data to it, and slap it on a $2 colored cardboard printout I get done at Staples. I'm complaining because of the fundamental issue with tying in-game experiences to amiibo. And despite everything I've said, the worst reason is this. Have you ever actually tried to get an amiibo after day one? Particularly very popular ones like the Skyward Sword Zelda inevitably will be. It's impossible sometimes, especially if you have a job or familial obligations or any kind of obligations that keep you from being able to go to the store and get one when they come out. Hylia knows that pre-ordering one is pretty much impossible unless you're simply lucky, and inevitably if you don't get one on day one, you're at the mercy of waiting for Nintendo to do a reprint. Otherwise you have to pay scalper prices. What this means is that you might be totally willing to pay for the amiibo to get access to this in-game feature, but if you aren't able to go day one, or if you are able to go but are simply unlucky, you just don't get to experience that content or that feature. Tough luck, too bad, good thing it's optional, right? And that really sucks. I think everybody should be able to sympathize with that. I've experienced this exact thing myself. I really like Breath of the Wild, and I really enjoy exploring it by myself, but as you'll know if you've watched previous videos of mine, I really like the idea of being able to explore it with a companion. Then I found out that Wolf Link could be scanned, and you could get Wolf Link himself as a companion. I love that. That's such a cool mechanic. So I set out in search of an amiibo so I could get my heckin' good boy, and guess what? They're long since sold out. I don't really like Twilight Princess, as many of you are probably aware, so I didn't buy the remaster when it came out, and as a result I never got the amiibo. And when I finally wanted it, Nintendo wasn't printing them anymore. I checked every game store in my city just to see if any of them so happened to have a couple left. Nothing. Which meant my only hope for getting a Wolf Link amiibo was to get one used. And while keeping in mind the Canadian currency is kind of in shambles, I couldn't find one for less than $80. And remember, I don't want the amiibo for the amiibo. I don't really care about Wolf Link and Midna that much. I literally only am looking for this amiibo so I can get access to this cool gameplay mechanic in Breath of the Wild. But because it was an older amiibo, I was just out of luck. If I wanted the ability to have a companion in Breath of the Wild, I'd need to pay $80. I think you can imagine the problem here. What if somebody picks up a copy of Breath of the Wild 10 years from now and really wants to have Wolf Link in their game? Or somebody picks up Skyward Sword HD 15 years from now and really wants the teleportation feature? Unless Nintendo is really on the ball with reruns, which historically they have not been, the prices of these amiibo are going to just skyrocket, and it will no longer be just prohibitive, but unrealistic for somebody to obtain these gameplay features without resorting to less than official means. And that is the fundamental issue with Amiibo. It's the fact that the gameplay feature is tied to a physical product that is subject to scarcity and supply and demand. Meaning that even if you have the money, you might just be out of luck because there are no Amiibo available to you. And I don't understand how someone can be okay with that. Be okay with people simply not having access to these in-game features in the future. Isn't that why we all hate always online video games? Are you sure that you're not just making an exception because it's a company you love doing it? I'm going to reiterate one last time. If you do want access to the teleport, but you don't want to buy the higher priced Amiibo, or if you're just unable to get one in time, look into NFC stickers. I'm not going to go into detail here out of interest of keeping this video from getting taken down, but if you do look into it, it's not very difficult at all. Ultimately, it is the practice itself that I take issue with, and it really does feel like Nintendo is embracing more and more anti-consumer practices as time goes on. Between the Joy-Cons, the bevy of issues with Nintendo Switch Online and the eShop, the prices of their remasters, and many more issues, it is slowly becoming more difficult to separate Nintendo from the other big corporations we usually associate with being greedy. We're not there yet, but I think we're definitely headed in that direction. Thanks for watching. If you like this video and you agree with me, let me know in the comments. If you disagree with me, also let me know and we'll talk about it. Though, as I always sadly have to say in these kinds of videos, and particularly ones about Skyward Sword, if you fling hate at myself or any of my commenters, your comment will be deleted and you will be muted. So please just save us both the energy and go swear at somebody on Reddit instead. I love disagreement, I don't like being called names. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay safe out there. If you do run into trouble, you best hope you have your Zelda amiibo on you so you can teleport out of there, because it's dangerous to go alone.